Welcome to our session whose topic is operating under authoritarian regimes. Broadly speaking, relationships between NGOs and the state have been cooperative, adversarial, awkward, sometimes catastrophic, contested, and even with authoritarian regimes sometimes. The kind of regimes that don't feel constitutionally obligated to be answerable to their citizens. These relationship models prevail at one time or another. Together to say relationships between the state and NGOs are diffuse, indeed complex. To help us unpack complex and sometimes difficult relationships are three panelists who have spent considerable time thinking about the topic. They will speak in the order they appear on the program. Each will speak for up to 20 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions and answers. You can either post a written question on the Q&A section or indicate in the same section that you'd like to raise a voice question, at which point we will unmute you. Please avoid lengthy questions so that we can accommodate more questions from the audience. Instead of introducing each panelist as their turn to speak comes up, I will introduce all of them right at the beginning of the panel discussion. When the first speaker finishes, he will call on the second speaker to present, and the second speaker will call on the third speaker, and the last speaker will then call on the moderator. Our first speaker is Ben Gossen. Ben Gossen is an historian focusing on US and Europe in the world. His areas of specializations are histories of science, statecraft, and global environment. Ben is currently visiting at Harvard University. He is the author of several books on Mennonites. His most recent publication is entitled Terms of Racial Endearment, Nazi Categorization of Mennonites in Ideology and Practice, from 1929 to 1945. Ben's presentation is entitled Dove and Swastika, Collaboration between MCC and the Nazi Regime, 1933 to 1942. After Ben is Johannes Dyck. Johannes Dyck was born in Siberia in the Soviet Union, and he grew up in Karaganda in Kazakhstan, a city that had the largest Mennonite and German population in late Soviet times. In 1989, his family immigrated to Germany. For the last 12 years, he has been working as a research fellow at the Bibelseminar in Bonn. Johannes is currently researching the Anabaptist tradition in the Soviet Union since the World War II. Johannes' paper is entitled MCC and the Iron Curtain, Serving the Mennonite Family in the USSR after World War II. Last presenter, but not the least, following Johannes, is Bernhard Thiessen. Bernhard Thiessen is a retired Mennonite pastor, currently a student at the Free University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and a curator of the exhibition Mennonites in GDR. For his PhD thesis, Bernhard is writing a thesis on the Mennonites in the GDR. His latest publication is entitled Life Within Limits, the Mennonites in the Soviet Zone and the the GDR from 1945 to 1990. The title of his presentation is MCC-Work and German Democratic Republic State Security, the Stasi, 1945 to 1989. Ben, take it away.
Thanks very much, Kim. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good day, depending on where you are in the world. I'm very pleased to be on this panel, and I'm particularly honored to be sharing it with my fellow presenters, Bernhard Thiessen and Johannes Dyck. I've known both Bernie and Johannes for a full decade now. They provided very kind support to me, including welcoming me in their homes when I was at the beginning stages of the research for my book, Chosen Nation, all the way back in 2012. Even though we're meeting on Zoom, I also want to ground myself in the physical place from which I'm coming to you, namely the city of Philadelphia. And I want to honor the original stewards of this land. I recognize and acknowledge that the city of Philadelphia stands on indigenous territory known as Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called the Lenni Lenape or Delaware Indians. These are people who, during the 1680s, negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania, and their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, Ramapoa Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. So to turn to the subject matter of my presentation, I'm in the rather unusual and actually quite nice position of being able to present on work that has already appeared in print. That wasn't my original intention when I proposed this presentation to the conference conveners in February of 2017. But since then, quite a lot has happened in the world of research with regards to the history of MCC and National Socialism. Just this past week, as many of you will know, MCC released a 68-page report on the history of its various entanglements with Nazism between 1929 and 1955. That report is the result of an invitation by MCC leadership to 12 scholars to consult internal MCC documents and to contextualize these alongside other sources collected at archives in Britain, Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Paraguay, and the United States. The overall report is eye-opening in its conclusions and excellent in its scholarship. I commend the full document to you, and if you have time, I'd encourage you to download it from MCC's website. If you do a Google search for MCC intersections, it should be the first link that you see. Please read the excellent work in the report by Esther F. Thiessen, Arnold Neufeld-Faust, John Eicher, Daniel Stahl, Stefan Azer, John Thiessen, Erika Weidemann, Aileen Friesen, Steve Schrader, David Barnow, and Astrid van Schlachte. I'd also like to specially commend Alan F. Weaver for a masterful job soliciting and editing this report, Frank Peachy and Lori Wise for outstanding work in making MCC's archival documents available to researchers in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Rick Kober-Bauman and Anne Graber-Hirschberger for their grace in supporting this inquiry, and for now soliciting responses and feedback from MCC supporters, other stakeholders in this history, and members of the general public. Since the full report is available online at this very moment, I won't spend my entire time reading it to you, but I would like to read the introductory and concluding remarks from my own contribution. So here to begin are the first paragraphs of my essay, which is entitled MCC and Nazism, 1929 to 1955. National Socialism played an important and until recently little understood role in the humanitarianism of Mennonite Central Committee during the organization's early years. Starting in 1929, the German government helped to bankroll MCC activities in Latin America, with the unanticipated result that after Hitler's accession to power in 1933, MCC owed the Third Reich a substantial monetary debt. Although US-based MCC leaders were not pro-Nazi, many of their contacts in Germany and Latin America were. These fascist Mennonites helped to push MCC to deepen its activities in the Third Reich. After the start of World War II, MCC began a relief program in Nazi-occupied Europe. Agency leaders learned about Nazi interest in resettling tens of thousands of Mennonites to Germany, and they contemplated aiding these plans. The United States' entry into the war in 1941, however, meant that it was the end of MCC's work in the Third Reich. MCC workers returned to Germany after Hitler's fall in 1945. Over the following decade, the organization undertook a massive humanitarian relief program among non-Mennonite Europeans while also helping nearly 15,000 Mennonite refugees relocate to the Americas. Virtually all of these migrants had received privileged treatment from Hitler's genocidal state, and some had participated directly in the Holocaust of European Jews. MCC administrators learned these facts, yet they consistently downplayed them in public statements and during dealings with United Nations affiliated refugee officials. Denial of Mennonite collaboration with Nazism at first helped to save refugees from deportation to the USSR, but beginning in 1947, the strategy mostly served to keep UN monies flowing into MCC coffers to support its work with Mennonite migrants and to protect the reputation of Mennonites. Over the ensuing years, MCC promoted a heroic narrative about the dramatic and providential rescue of desperate Mennonite refugees after World War II. These accounts contributed to suppressing sustained inquiry into Mennonite Nazi collaboration until recent years. So that's from my introduction. I'd also like to read a few paragraphs from the conclusion of my article. Until now, MCC has not publicly grappled with the ways its humanitarian work with Mennonites from Europe before, during, and after the Second World War was entangled with Nazism and its legacy. Information contained in the newly released special issue of Intersections will likely be new to most readers. Starting as MCC wrapped up its European resettlement work, the organization tenaciously sought to shape historical accounts of these efforts. MCC leadership fought in the early 1950s, for instance, to censor the official history of the United Nations overall European refugee program. Staff objected to claims in the initial draft that the Russian Mennonites were not eligible for the help they received, and that displaced Mennonites from the Soviet Union concealed evidence on the instruction of MCC representatives. MCC's own files show these accusations to be unquestionably true. Yet MCC successfully enlisted allies at the US State Department to insist that the manuscript be revised to ensure that MCC, quote, receive better treatment, end quote. Over the following decades, MCC continued to advance narratives about the providential salvation of persecuted refugees from the Soviet Union, further covering over the complex, multifaceted ways that these and other Mennonites had collaborated with or benefited from Nazism. As MCC confronts this past, addressing the legacies of institutional anti-Semitism should be a priority. Central MCC leaders were not pro-Nazi, yet MCC willingly partnered with ardent National Socialists in the 1930s and early 1940s to enlist the Third Reich's assistance for its international Mennonite relief efforts. Prior to the US's entry into the war, MCC considered what resettlement efforts for Mennonites might look like in the event of successful German conquest of territory on its Eastern Front. After World War II, MCC devoted significant financial and human resources over a multi-year period to help resettle thousands of Mennonites from the former Free City of Danzig, Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union. Many of these migrants had various forms of Nazi entanglements, including cases of participation in units of the German military and security apparatus most directly involved in Hitler's program of genocide. MCC's decisions to work with National Socialists during the Third Reich and then to downplay Mennonite Nazi collaboration after World War II reflected fierce in-group loyalties, but also a broad ambivalence toward Hitler's victims. MCC distributed modest aid to Jews, and its leaders occasionally expressed dismay at examples of blatant anti-Semitism. Yet officials also took advantage of anti-Semitic prejudices among external refugee organizations to advocate better access for Mennonites. When the director of MCC's Mennonite Aid section learned in 1947 that certain elected lawmakers opposed admitting so many Jewish refugees to the US as compared to the number of Protestants, he assessed that, quote, time is now ripe, end quote, for MCC to press United States authorities to accept Mennonite applicants. Others blamed Jews for taking transport spots from Mennonites and for raising too many questions about their wartime activities. MCC's European Commissioner for Refugee Aid and Resettlement, C.F. Gossen, resented Jewish migrants, whom he claimed appeared before United Nations screening officers in poor clothing, and then, after passing inspection, wore, quote, expensive furs and dresses with more than one diamond ring on their fingers and other jewelry, end quote. Gossen also identified Jews among the UN agents most responsible for raising roadblocks to Mennonites' own eligibility for financial help, disparaging a supposed pattern of, quote, ignorance, prejudice, stupidity, and not seldom even wickedness, end quote. Gossen and his colleagues pursued their goals by advocating a topsy-turvy version of history in which European Mennonites had allegedly suffered under totalitarian rule as much or more than Jews. Extensive archival research in recent years by multiple scholars has thoroughly discredited such fictions. So those were my overall findings, and as I mentioned, there's much more in the MCC Intersections final report. With the balance of my presentation, I'd like to briefly draw attention to two additional points, which I think might offer some helpful context. Both of these points are discussed in the recent MCC report, but I'd like to highlight them here. The first point has to do with one of the major motivational factors in the history of MCC's entanglements with Nazism. And I think it's worth saying this point explicitly. It's a complicated history with many moving parts. But one of the key factors which unites both the early period of this history, that is from 1929 to 1945, as well as the later part, which would be 1945 to 1955, is money. One of the ways to summarize the role of money in MCC's dealings with Nazism would be that during the Nazi era itself, there was money in collaborating with the Nazis. But during the post-war period, that is after 1945, there was money in denying Nazi collaboration. Again, you can read the full details in MCC's recent report, but the general gist is that between 1933, when Hitler came to power, and 1941, when the United States entered the war, MCC owed the Nazis a substantial monetary debt. This was certainly not intentional, since the original loan came from the pre-Nazi German government to support the transportation of Mennonite refugees to Latin America. MCC had little interest in dealing with the Nazis at all, yet the debt matter kept them tethered to the Third Reich more tightly than the organization desired. It was largely to negotiate this debt issue that MCC became dependent on an ardent Nazi, Benjamin Unruh, to represent their interests in Berlin. At the time that the debt was initially due in 1935, the value, if adjusted for inflation and converted to 2021 US currency, was about $7.5 million. MCC never actually had to pay this debt, in part because Benjamin Unruh was successful at pushing off payments until Hitler declared war on the United States. Then, after World War II, MCC benefited financially from United Nations affiliated refugee organizations. Starting in 1941, the UN paid a large percentage of MCC's post-war refugee activities. It paid what would be the inflation-adjusted equivalent today of $2 million for the first shipload of Mennonite refugees that sailed to Paraguay. Ultimately, by the early 1950s, the UN paid for the transatlantic travel of a total of 11,500 refugees. These payments would be worth around $11.5 million today. And the UN also paid for rail transport within Europe and for food at MCC's refugee camps in Germany. It's a little tricky to hazard exact figures given the dispersed nature of these activities, the conversion rates between currencies, and the need to factor in different inflationary adjustments for different years. But if we keep in mind that MCC ran multiple refugee camps in Germany over a period of several years, we can calculate conservatively that MCC received a grand total of at least $15 million, inflation adjusted, from the UN for all costs between 1947 and the early 1950s. If we combine that figure with the debt that MCC never had to repay to the Nazi government, in part because of its pre-war employment of the Nazi go-between Benjamin Unruh, the total sums we're talking about here would be worth the equivalent today of over $20 million US. And finally, I'd like to raise a second point. I talked about this point already, but I'd like to come back to it. And the second point is anti-Semitism. This is a tough word. It's a very tough history. Certainly no one today wants to be associated with anti-Semitism. But talking about anti-Semitism is important. Anti-Semitic acts are on the rise around the world today with very serious consequences for Jews. It's worth clarifying that there are many kinds of anti-Semitism. When I say that institutional anti-Semitism characterized MCC in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, I am not talking about the eliminationist anti-Semitism that had been the hallmark of Hitler's war against the Jews during the Holocaust. Central MCC leadership never promoted that kind of genocidal evil. So when I use the words MCC and anti-Semitism together in the same sentence, that is not what I mean. This is tricky to explain precisely because of the way that MCC treated Jews after 1945. Specifically, the organization claimed that Mennonites were like Jews. This assertion had a number of implications. For instance, it correctly implied that Jews had been persecuted under the Nazis and that Jews were deserving of aid. However, this claim that Mennonites were like Jews had some less savory implications as well. It suggested that Mennonites were innocent of Nazi collaboration, that they had not been involved in anti-Semitic acts during the Second World War, and that they were at least as, and perhaps more deserving of humanitarian assistance than Jews, a people that had just experienced an all-out attempt by the Nazis to eliminate them from the earth as a group. Of course, Mennonites had suffered terribly under communist rule in the Soviet Union, and the experience of Mennonites during the Second World War were often extremely difficult, whether under Nazi rule or otherwise. But for MCC to suggest that Mennonites were like Jews at the same time that they knowingly provided aid to individuals who had participated in the Holocaust can only be understood in the context of anti-Semitism. And I'll provide just one quick example before I wrap up. But again, there are many more details in the recent MCC report, which I encourage everyone to read. The specific narrative that Mennonites were like Jews emerged among MCC central leadership around July 1946. After discussing this strategy with other top-level MCC officials, one staff member wrote a memorandum to the 100 most important leaders of the Mennonite refugee community scattered across Europe, stating that they should portray themselves as being like the Jews. Refugee leaders began using this line, and it was even reported in the New York Times. Yet, while MCC leaders were promoting this argument, they also learned that some of the individuals under their care had been involved in murdering Jews during the Holocaust. MCC staff paid close attention to the trial of the Einsatzgruppe death squad leaders in Nuremberg during 1947 and 1948, because one of the refugees under their care was a witness there. After this trial, MCC workers began trying to understand more about Mennonite Nazi collaboration. They learned, for instance, that a refugee in MCC's Bachnang camp had joined a Nazi death squad responsible for murdering tens of thousands of Jews. One might expect MCC to have seriously discussed how to handle refugees like this man, whose name was Jakob Ediger. But that is not the case. In April 1949, the very same MCC staff member who had originally recommended that all refugee leaders portray themselves as being like Jews wrote a letter to Ediger. The purpose of this letter was not to address Ediger's wartime actions, but in fact to congratulate him on the occasion of his baptism at Bachnang. In the historical period under discussion, anti-Semitism was widespread on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, overt anti-Semitism was becoming increasingly anathema in the public sphere. MCC staff were thus very much embedded in the larger cultural fabric of their time. It is certainly not impossible to hold two seemingly different truths as simultaneously valid, namely that MCC workers spoke positively of Jews and even tried to depict themselves as a comparable group, while also pursuing policies that disadvantaged Jews or that prevented public discussion of Mennonite anti-Semitism from taking place. Such discussions are largely now just getting underway decades later in the 21st century. Institutional anti-Semitism refers not to what an organization's spokespersons say, but to the effects that are generated over time by the agency as a whole. I'd like to conclude my presentation by reiterating my personal thanks to present-day MCC staff for their leadership in helping us to seriously and publicly face this difficult past. This important conversation has significance far beyond MCC itself. It extends to Mennonites as a whole, to Jews, and to others with whom Mennonites engage. I am grateful for the work that dozens of principled archivists, historians, journalists, administrators, and others have done so far. And I look forward to following along as others in the church and beyond continue to weigh in over the coming months. So I'll leave it there for now and thank everyone for your attention. I'm now very much looking forward to the presentations of my fellow panelists, and I will turn it over to Johannes.
Thank you, Ben. I will try to share my screen. I hope it works, but in a different way, okay? A second try. We will do it in this way. I hope you see the presentation. Do you see it?
Yes, we do.
Oh, thank you. I would like to present a combination of findings from Soviet and North American archives. First of all, the situation. During the Cold War, the MCC had to play the main role in the fraternal relations between Mennonites in North America and Soviet Union. These relations suffered severely due to the Soviet Union's self-imposed isolation from the foreign countries. The MCC was left with only a narrow corridor of opportunities. Complicating the situation was the legal status of Mennonites in the USSR. Until 1965, they were in deportation without a right to free movement like all Germans. Until 1966, their religion was considered anti-social and anti-state because of the 1925 reaffirmed pacifist position. Only after a change in Soviet religious policy, the religion became legal. The Mennonites on the western side of the Iron Curtain in the 1970s were to 40% of Russian descent. This explains the close ties and great interest in the fate of their brothers and sisters according to blood and the faith. The Soviet direction was a priority for the MCC for a number of reasons. Already its establishment in 1920 was a reaction to the plight of Mennonite brethren in the USSR. After the end of World War II, the MCC organized the emigration of Soviet Mennonites from the territory of defeated Germany to Americas, which was not advertised in contacts with the Soviets, nor was there a mention of the Mennonites in the USSR file of the MCC European Bureau, which was maintained until 1979 and contained up to 18,000 names. None of the foreign religious centers was interested in the situation of co-religionists in the USSR and had as much information about them as MCC. The first post-war initiative of the MCC follows. The MCC established its first contact with the Free Church officials from the USSR in England, 1955. The following year, in 1956, the MCC sent the Soviet Union one of the most prominent American Mennonites, Harold Bender, accompanied by David Wiens, a former Soviet citizen. They arrived in Moscow on a tourist visa, were warmly welcomed at the Baptist Union, but they had no chance to meet Mennonites in the areas of their special settlements. And Bender's trip to the USSR is described in details by me in an article last year, as was published in Mennonite Geschichtsblätter. Perhaps the most important consequence of Bender's trip was that the top officials of the State Religious Observation Agency, named Council of Religious Affairs, realized that there was considerable interest in the Mennonites in the Soviet Union and the West. Subsequently, meetings between the MCC representatives and the Baptist Union took place either in the West or during their own trips to the USSR as tourists on a state-approved itinerary. Up to 1947, 74, 10 such meetings took place in different places in the Soviet Union. The focus on the legal Baptist Union presented the MCC with a number of difficulties. For decades, much of the North American media had portrayed the legal Baptist Church as an agent of communism. The division among Baptists in USSR in 1961, resulting from the persecutions, was echoed in the North American Mennonite community, where members of the radical Baptist wing had close relatives. The MCC was also well aware that Soviet religious leaders avoided even the slightest mention of persecution of believers in Eastern Europe in international religious organizations, such as the Baptist World Alliance. MCC developed a new strategy. In 1973, the MCC adopted a new strategy on the Soviet direction that included cooperation with communism critical agencies. It was the first Western confessional center to cooperate with Michael Bourdeaux's Center for Study of Religion and Communism in London, the future Keston College. Bourdeaux, who by then had published several books, had a reputation as a voice of persecuted for the faith behind the Iron Curtain. Although he was disliked by the World Council of Churches, Bourdeaux was not known as an anti-Soviet, unlike, for example, Richard Wurmbrand, who attacked American Mennonites, reproaching them for forgetting their martyrs for the faith, using, however, photographs from actual Mennonite sources. The MCC also feared complications in its relations with the Soviet authorities, believing that cooperation with the center might completely block its path into the USSR. It sent to the Bordeaux Center a young Canadian doctoral candidate, Walter Zawatsky, a grandson of Russian Mennonite immigrants, who at the time was working on a dissertation on a Russian nobleman from the beginning of the 19th century, at a time of strong Western pietist influence on Orthodoxy. Zawatsky was well versed in Baptist, Mennonite, as well Orthodox themes. Among the center's permanent staff, Zawatsky had the highest academic status. By assigning as employee the Center for Study of Religious and Communism, the MCC leadership not only gained access to a wide variety of information about the USSR, but also established a channel of influence to related denominations in the West that were also working in the Soviet Union direction. Not only did Zawatsky read the popular daily newspapers from Moscow and the province, but he also handled the latest bulletins of the Baptist Illegal Prisoners Relatives Council, not to mention the periodicals of the official religious centers and atheist literature. A priority for Zawatsky was his own trips to the USSR. Shortly before taking up his post as the Bordeaux Center, he was able to spend a month in Leningrad as a student in 1973. A year later, while still a staff member, but still a doctoral candidate in history, he spent 2 months in the Soviet Union as part of a Soviet-Canadian cultural exchange program. While working in the archives and libraries of Leningrad and Moscow, he also immersed himself in Baptist church life as much as he could. He spent about a month in Moscow, where he studied in detail the work of the Baptist Union. Prior to that, he had been to Novosibirsk, Tashkent, and Almaty, where he first met Soviet Mennonites in their midst and even met their representatives of at the Union, Jakob Fast. The aspect of reunion of relatives in the context of the German immigration from the USSR also remained on the MCC screen. When notable German immigration from the USSR to West Germany began in 1972, the MCC immediately established close contact with immigrants from both legal and illegal churches. However, long-term cooperation with them didn't materialize, despite the best efforts of North Americans. The Soviet policy of detent was also reflected in the fact that Zawatsky's 3-year participation in the Center for the Study of Religious and Communism had no negative consequences for the MCC or for himself. Both Zawatsky and his direct supervisor and the MCC, Peter Dyck, were invited as guests to the next Congress of the Baptist Union in 1974. In 1976, the relationship between the MCC and the Baptist Union reached a new level. For the first time, the USSR was visited by an official Mennonite delegation of 5 people. In Kazakhstan, they were even allowed to visit 2 churches outside the capital. But the Kyrgyz authorities, in defiance of their Moscow superiors, refused to allow them to visit their republic. The Mennonites regarded as very important a reception at the Governmental Council on Religious Affairs, where she was received by the deputy chairman Titov, who had represented the Soviet Union for 5 years at the UN in human rights issues. He was given a list of 179 prisoners of conscience. The government preferred such behind-the-scenes meetings to demonstrations in the West. The MCC strategy proved successful. Zawatsky and within the MCC became an important source on the believers in the USSR. His materials were published not only in the Bordeaux Center journal Religion and Communist Lands, but were also sent out as MCC press releases to the Mennonite and other denominational press. Zawatsky proposed to the MCC the idea for a book on the modern history of the Russian evangelical movement, and he offered his services to produce one. In 1980, however, the MCC concept failed. Zawatsky was tasked with organizing a Mennonite World Conference delegation to the USSR. A decision was made to travel to the USSR through the State Travel Agency. Zawatsky and the Secretary General of the World Conference, Paul Krabel, were, however, welcomed in Moscow as a delegation of the Baptist Union. At the Council for Religious Affairs, they had an hour-and-a-half conversation with the head of the non-Orthodox department, to whom they laid out both the plan for their forthcoming trip around the country and the prospects for international cooperation. He had no objections, as Zawatsky and Krabel went on a trip around the country as tourists, without the usual escort from the Baptist Union. On May 21st, 22nd, Zawatsky and Krabel were in Almaty. On the first day, they talked throughoutly with the Baptists. On the second day, they had their first and last, I might add, meeting with the Mennonites in their prayer house, which was not attended by any of the Baptist leadership. 20 Mennonite ministers from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan attended. The three-hour fellowship continued with a 2-hour dinner on the same location. It left a lasting impression on the Americans. The meetings between Zawatsky and Krabel in Almaty in a free atmosphere caused the explosion of indignation among the local authorities. The Council for Religious Affairs Commissioner in Kazakhstan, Begimov, gave a shattering blow to the Baptist and Mennonite leadership with a stern warning. 2 weeks later, he reported to his supervisors in Moscow, listing a whole set of anti-clerical claims. The arrival of foreign Mennonites helped to intensify religious life among Baptists and Mennonites. aroused interest among young believers in the situation of religion in the West, and to some extent led to the excitement of nationalist sentiments among believers of German nationality. In connection with the increasing frequencies of trips of Zawatsky and Prebil to Kazakhstan with missionary purposes, I considered it expedient to raise the question before the appropriate agencies to limit them. The completion of the policy of the time received an unexpected local coloring. Naturally, neither the MCC nor Zawatsky learned anything about the protest from Kazakhstan. In September 1980, Zawatsky was promoted to MCC Secretary for Europe. In 1981, he published his famous book, Soviet Evangelicals since World War II, which was over 500 pages long and had numerous illustrations. To this day, this monograph remains the only one on the history of the Soviet post-war evangelical movement written in a confessional discourse. The book has long been a classic. After a series of refusals of Soviet visas, the MCC concluded that Zawatsky had inexplicably become inadmissible in the USSR. For this reason, he had to leave Europe in 1985 and to look for a new job. This was a Western precedent for a ban of profession. Zawatsky's problems with the Soviet authorities didn't serve as a serious obstacle to the MCC's Eastern projects. With perestroika and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Eastern direction of work initially received a strong impetus, but then was quickly curtailed. I come to the conclusion. The post-war activities of the MCC for the USSR are vivid testimony of confessional solidarity, which found ways and means to overcome the Iron Curtain and formulate its own strategy, which was not in line with the Soviet religious policy, but nevertheless accepted by the Soviet authorities. The example of a marginal confessional community also illustrates the evolution of Soviet religious policy from one of the total suppression of religion to one of tolerance under the influence of international factors. There are many details in this process that could be the subject of a separate study. I thank for your attention, and I would like to give the floor to my friend Bernhard Thiessen. Bernhard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks you, Johannes. I try to share my screen. Okay, thanks first for the invitation and also the warm welcome from Kim. Greetings from Berlin and Germany, and now the presentation that goes about MCC and the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit. This is a security ministry in the GDR and the Mennonites in the GDR. This is the theme I want to talk about. Close to 3 million people left the GDR, East Germany, from 1945 to the time the Berlin Wall was built in August 13th in 1961. All of those refugees who fled from the GDR arrived in emergency recept center or emergency recept camp. In Berlin West, it's called Marienfelde. And they were given a Laufzettel, a routing slip. You see one on the left side here on the slide.
Bernhard, you're not sharing your screen.
What?
You're not sharing your screen, just a heads up.
Really not? I see my screen.
You have to hit
the... What is going on?
If you hit the share screen.
Was I too fast?
Maybe.
What do I have to do?
There's a share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
You can't see my PowerPoint?
No.
Oh. Technique. I go on the green button.
Yep.
And then?
And then you click your PowerPoint. And then hit share.
And then hit the share again. Okay, I click my PowerPoint. Oh, then no, doesn't work like that. Sorry for that. Oh, is
There you
this
go.
now? Here we go. Woo! Then we start again. Sorry. Now you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Then I have to start again. I hope that's no big problem. Okay, I said MCC and the state security and the Mennonites in the GDR. And here is the situation. 3 million refugees come from the east, and now we are in Berlin West in the emergency reception camp. It's called Marienfelde, and you see this little Laufzettel on the left side. It's yeah, on the point 2, Zuständigkeitsprüfung. It's just a very not very special word, but it's check the responsibility. It is meant, but there is a procedure is very important, because all the secret services from the West, the Western Allies and the Federal Republic of Germany, and also now we know that German Democratic Republic's Secret Service, all they together were on this point and try to examine the refugees and also try to get influence. You don't see my next picture?
You'll need to change the slide.
I changed the slide here on my picture, but not in yours?
No.
Ah, this is crazy. Was soll ich tun? What shall I do?
There we go.
Okay.
Maybe I just don't make a presentation, but only this, what Johannes also did, just show this one. You can read the presentation here?
Yeah, you're on the second one now.
Okay. Hey, it's complicated. Okay. Jetzt ist wieder weg. This is a little too crazy for me. Okay, takes a little longer to go through that. Okay, I will tell you, in that camp, the emergency reception camp, there will come all these refugees from the east, and they were examined by all the different security services from all the West. The higher ranking the refugee was, the longer the procedure took. The refugees who had special important state or military duties in the GDR could be questioned for several months in some case. And particularly important persons were immediately flown out of the West Germany by the US Army, so to the Eastern German Security Service could not retrieve them and bring them back to the GDR. Today, it is estimated that about 10% of all refugees who came in this camp were from the East German state security. Others, especially young people, from they expect just a little information, they get the stamp for station 2 very fast, and then they also can leave, at least temporarily, the camp until they receive their full recognition. You see here the Laufzettel of Familie Fromm. They are Mennonites, and they could go to the Menno home in the west side of the country. We can see that we are in the middle of the so-called Cold War, and it is no wonder that the MCC-2, when it worked in Berlin and worked with refugees from the GDR, was under observation by the secret services from all countries. We will focus our consideration on the secret service of the GDR, the Ministry for State Security, it's called, Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, and normally it's called the Stasi, the short word, and its officials and secret informants and their contacts with the MCC. The German Democratic Republic, GDR, was founded in 1949, and the Ministry for State Security, MFS, was founded in 1950. The MFS developed into an apparatus of surveillance and repression. In 1989, this is the numbers you can read here, there were 91,000 full-time employees at the state security, and the GDR has 17 million people. And there were another 150,000 informal collaborators. That means informelle Mitarbeiter, or EM, it's a short name. The Stasi tried again and again to discover the weak points of its citizens in order to make them compliant and for its interests, and to recruit them for informers. We must therefore distinguish between the primary officers of the secret police and the informal collaborators, who often continues as neighbors, friends, relatives, or even work colleagues. Mennonites and the MCC had deal with both, and I will show now 4 examples. At the first example, here you see the map from Germany and the occupied zone. Here is West Prussia, East Prussia, where a lot of Mennonites live, and they flee to the west. And this here is the area of the Soviet occupied zone, the SBZ we call it. And this is Berlin in the middle, and you can see Berlin here. And here are 4 sectors: the French sector, the British sector, the American sector, and the Russian sector. This is Berlin, was also divided in four parts. MCC representative Peter Dyck drives through the American sector in Berlin, Lichterfelde West, in an US military jeep in June 1946, and chooses a house as headquarters for the MCC. Later, he reported, the Germans had lost the war, the Americans were now in charge, and if they wanted German houses, they simply commanded them, and so we go back to Ringstraße 107, and I said, that one. The flight from the GDR to the west, which was supported by MCC, was also closely watched by the GDR People's Police, and also by the MFS, by the Stasi. Oops. Next one. Okay. It was also looked at, and there was a spy in a service which held by Mr. Götzke, a Mennonite preacher. And this spy, he was reporting to his superior what he had learned in a Mennonite church service. And this is what he had learned. The financing of the border crossing is provided by a pastor from America who is still supported by a believer in the sect who is the owner of a knife factory in America. The money from these 2 persons would only be spent for the crossing, and each member would have to work over their first 1 year in agriculture, for which there is no payment. This is what the spy told his chief. And later on, the Mennonites, they tried to forbid the Mennonites. And this is the Minister of Interior of the GDR, Mr. Steinhoff, and he said the justification to forbid the Mennonites, to ban the Mennonites in the GDR, the Mennonites are controlled by Anglo-American warmongers, that means the US Army, deprive the GDR people of manpower because they flee over the border, steal people's property and values, that means horses, wagons, bicycles, all what they took when they fly, and damage the development of the socialist society. This was the reason why they want to forbid the Mennonites. The prohibition did not come to pass, but as late as 1967, 20 years after Peter Dyck drove the US Jeep in Berlin, the Stasi reported on the Mennonites and stated that the MCC had set up a headquarters in Berlin with the help of the American military government, which had confiscated houses by means of American requisition orders and made them available to the MCC. That means the connection between the US Army and the Mennonites. This was the first example. Go to the next example. After the horrors of World War II, many churches realized that war is contrary to the will of God. This was what the World Council of Churches said in 1948. And the Mennonite and the peace churches, they said, peace is the will of God. The so-called historic peace churches, Mennonites, Quakers, and Churches of Brethren, together with the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, agreed to talks with Protestant churches, that Lutherans and Reforms, on this project, on this subject, the peace. Specifically, 4 Puy-du conferences were held between 1955 and 1962, named after the first place they met. It was Puy-du in Switzerland. Beginning in 1960, the conferences also became a forum for mediated discussions between Christians from the East and the West. From the East came mainly leading representatives of the so-called Prague Christian Peace Conference. The topics such as the significance of the Lordship of Christ for our existence in state and society attracted the interest of the GDR Secret Service. And therefore, they sent this theologian, Gerhard Baserac, to the meeting in 1960, and the Stasi assignment in 1960 for Bièvre in France was, the aim of this trip is to obtain information about the ideas of these organizations and their leading personalities, and to establish contacts with ecumenical personalities. Making contacts was always associated with a hope of gaining influence. Baserac worked at that time for the Stasi under the cover name G.I. Freund, that means Geheimer Informant, secret informer. In fact, Baserac met the Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder at this meeting in Bièvre in 1960 at the latest. Maybe they met a little earlier, but at the latest in this time, Yoder was on the Baserac's mailing list, which was also available to the Stasi. We can find it in the Stasi archives. And in 1965, John Howard Yoder was commissioned by the MCC Peace Section to travel with a group of theological students for 3 weeks through East Germany and Czechoslovakia to build bridges beyond the Iron Curtain. On the east side was Gerhard Baserac in the service of the Stasi to lead the group of students. 5 years later, the Canadian John Rampell studied in Berlin in 1970-71. He lived in the West Berlin and traveled every day to the east. He took part in a seminar with a Gerhard Baserac, who had in the meantime, with the help of the Stasi, risen in status and had become a professor. Baserac moved the seminary from the official university rooms to his private living room in his flat. On the grounds, he said to the people, "We can talk here more openly with each other than in the university." Hardly anyone suspected that Professor Dr. Baserac was spying for the state security now under the codename E.M. Buss. Rampell was aghast when he heard this in an interview I had with him in 2019. Baserac did not want spying North Americans like John Rampell, but rather wanted to encourage East German students to tell their stories. They should say what they really think about the state and its representatives, so that the Stasi could better assess and control future pastors. The MCC and the Vietnam. The MCC had been active in Vietnam since 1954. Beginning in the mid-1960s, MCC leaders increasingly recognized that if they were to carry out peace and reconciliation work in the Vietnam War credibly, they would have to help victims on both sides. Thus, Adlai Beachy made a secret mission trip to Algiers, Paris, Czechoslovakia, and the GDR on behalf of the MCC in the summer of 1968. His purpose was to establish contacts with the North Vietnamese government in exile and the National Liberation Front. During this trip, Beachy met Dr. Herbert Landmann, a pulmonary specialist and a Vietnam expert from East Germany. The contact was arranged by MCC staff in Europe, John Wheeler, and more importantly, Canadian pastor John R. Thiessen, who at that time was working with his wife Marion in Berlin at the Mennoheim. In the top secret report of this meeting, Adlai Beachy is summarized as follows. It is too early to evaluate how significant this channel might be for further contacts, but I'm inclined to believe that Dr. Landmann is an important figure in the fabric of power structure related to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and that he is in a position to interpret our purposes to people in responsible positions. Adlai Beachy then assessed Landmann's position within the hierarchy of the GDR to be influential enough to well advance the Mennonite efforts for North Vietnam. John Thiessen then organized 4 ship trips, transportations reaching North Vietnam. And this with the help of Herbert Landmann and his contacts to the representatives in GDR and also in the North Vietnam embassy. So the material could leave East Berlin, go to Poland via Poland, and go with a ship to North Vietnam. And we have the document of a telegram that they reach also North Vietnam. These 4 different transportation. Thus, the MCC was also able to help the suffering population in the enemy country. This was what they liked to do. In the meantime, we have learned that Dr. Herbert Landmann worked as an informant, a codename EM Chef, for the Stasi, and uses the Mennonite pastor John R. Thiessen as a so-called blind informer on their behalf. For example, Landmann asked Thiessen to find out the address of a young man who had fled the GDR. Willing to help and unaware of where the order actually came from, Thiessen asked around in West Berlin until he finally found out the address of this young refugee and was able to joyfully communicate it to his friend Herbert, and who immediately revealed it to the Stasi. The next and last example, Stasi and the MCC. Pastor Knut Hansen, set free for 10 years from his employee. He is a Lutheran pastor, and he was set free for the Lutheran Church in the GDR to come to the Mennonites following the retired leader Walter Janssen. Hansen was employed pastor of the Mennonite congregation in the GDR in 1980. After the Berlin Wall was turned down in the 1990, it became known that Knut Hansen had already been targeted by the Stasi in the late 1960s through his friend Gerd Bambowski, and that he had worked for the Stasi together with Bambowski since 1971. Hansen's codename was E.M. Paul. In 1980, when the help of Gerd Bambowski, the Stasi placed Pastor Hansen as a so-called E.M. influencer in the Mennonite congregations in the GDR. His priority was to provide information about Mennonite contacts in the USSR to help uncover so-called smuggling of religious literature and Bibles from the West to the East. Most of all, the Soviet Secret Service, the KGB, was interested in this information, and the Stasi cooperated with the KGB. With the help of Gerd Bambowski in particular, an illegal print shop was discovered in the USSR. The printing presses were confiscated and the people responsible arrested. Now, via Hansen, the EM Paul, the MCC was also to be infiltrated. Angeschleust is the Stasi jargon for this thing. The file on the exchange of the so-called fraternal organizations, the KGB and the Stasi, they had a file, and that status, E.M. Paul traveled to the SU, that's the Soviet Union, for the first time after his appointment to a church leadership position with the Mennonites. The Western headquarters of the Mennonites, meaning the MCC, it was in Neuwied in West Germany, and the leader was Walter Zawatsky. We heard about him when Johannes told about him. The Western headquarters of the MCC immediately reacted to this and gave him specific orders. In implementation of these orders, he came into contact with politically operationally relevant circles among Soviet Baptists. During the assignment, he established a good contact with the representatives of the Mennonites in Canada. You see here in this jacket is a little Canadian flag. E.M. Paul, we don't know exactly what he was really working on, to what extent the Stasi and thus the KGB succeeded in obtaining informations or even exerting influence on the activities of the MCC. This is not known. Maybe it was not too big, but this is, you see, they try to get in this contact and go on to influence the Mennonites. We come to the conclusion, who is on which side? First, at the time of the so-called Cold War, the MCC, through its employees, repeatedly sought contacts with fellow believers in countries of the Eastern Bloc. The most important message from MCC was, we have not forgotten you. And the MCC also wanted to use all its possibilities to give witness of peace and reconciliation and to practice love of enemies in the following of Jesus Christ. Certainly, it was not really always clear who is on which side, but the MCC had to reckon with the fact that their people and their contacts were being spied on. This was that you have to recognize. Declaring that Mennonites have nothing to hide is not an adequate exoneration if they have, consciously or unconsciously, contact with intelligence services in the process. That's what I often heard. Oh, we don't have anything to hide. We can just go on. I think MCC is co-responsible not only for the employees, but also for other people they meet in these countries. On the one hand, it must be considered whether other people, such as John Rampell's fellow students at the University of Berlin, were put in danger by these contacts. And on the other hand, it needs theological and ethical standards for its own actions. Those who do not want to know who is betraying them or using them may act more freely maybe, but they are also become naive victims themselves more quickly. And therefore I would like to ask two questions. Where must the theological ethical line be drawn in cooperation with people with enemies such as secret services? Or do we have to love all enemies? And the second question, what would have been alternative actions in this respective situations and the history, but also now? Thanks for attention and thanks for the beginning problems. And not thanks for, but thanks for your attention at that time. If you want to read more, it's on my website, mennoniten-ddr.de. Okay, now the host. Kim, are you there?
Hello. Now we'll open up the session for questions. I see that we already have 7, and you may write your question and post it in the Q&A or raise a voice question. So I will read the first question while we are getting ready for more questions here. The first question is from Peter Longerek. Excuse me if I'm not really pronouncing your word very well. Peter Longerek wrote separate biographies. This is from Donald Peters of Hitler and Helmer, and published by Oxford University Press in 2019 and 2012 respectively. In the Hitler biography, he claims that 363,211 Jews were killed in Ukraine between September 1 and December 31, 1942. Gossen states that Benjamin Unruh meets Helmer in Germany for a 3-day encounter between December 31, 1942 and January 2, 1943. Could Benjamin Unruh not have known what Helmer was responsible for during the Ukraine visit?
Hi, thanks for the question. As I understand it, the question is essentially, did Benjamin Unruh know about the Holocaust? And that's an important question because he was MCC's primary representative in Germany from 1936 to 1942, and then he also worked with MCC after World War II. And the answer is yes, Benjamin Unruh absolutely knew about the Holocaust. The work of Peter Fritzsche, for example, Life and Death of the Third Reich, which is a book you can read, illustrates the general knowledge that people in Germany had of the Holocaust at the time that it was unfolding. In the specific case of Benjamin Unruh, he's quite clear about this in his testimony at Nuremberg after World War II. He was asked point blank, did you know about the Holocaust? He said, of course. We also have the post-war memoirs of Anna Suderman, who was a woman from the Korditsa colony who met with Benjamin Unruh during the war and personally told him, according to her post-war recollections, that Jews were shot in mass around the Mennonite colonies in Ukraine. He was absolutely aware. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And the second question is for Gossen as well. Ben, the Interconnect publication and your presentation unpack an entanglement of loyalty to tribe, pragmatism and idealism with an undercurrent of anti-Semitism. Were MCC leaders so naive, or couldn't they avoid it? Where was oversight from North American Mennonite leaders?
Thanks, Alan, for this question. Central MCC leadership at this time was primarily North American. The prominent leaders of MCC included the most prominent leaders of North American Mennonite communities, or at least some of them, folks like Harold Bender, Ori Miller, Robert Kreider, C.F. Clausen, Peter Dyck, folks that continued to be very important in the church afterwards. That's who this group of individuals were who were making the highest level decisions about how to treat refugees after World War II who had been involved with Nazism during the war.
Okay, I think this is a general question, which of course I'm raising to both Bernhard and Johannes. It seems as if there was this collaboration which was done largely by European Mennonites during the Second World War and on. What was the real relationship between, on this question of oversight, what was the relationship between the European Mennonites and the North American ones in terms of oversight? Question now directed to Bernhard and Johannes.
Johannes, you want to answer?
Mm-hmm. I would say be the first one.
Sorry?
Maybe I didn't get the question right. The connection between the German Mennonites and the North Americans, and in what time? What was the question?
Immediately after the Second World War, in
Yeah,
terms of oversight, yes, were they fully
Oversight?
aware that there was collaboration with the, for instance, the Nazi regime?
I'm after my research is after the Second World War, and I don't think that the North Americans and the Germans, they know about that there is a state security behind some actions, but they think about. I was told that this Knut Hansen, the pastor, others, Lutheran pastors told the Mennonites, be careful, he has too good connections to the state. That means don't talk too much to him. And so the American MCC workers, they also knew about that. And I thought that they are careful enough, but I don't know exactly. I talked to Walter Zawatsky about Knut Hansen, about this pastor, and he did not really think that he has a great influence on the MCC. But he was still there, and the Stasi tried to get influence on the MCC. If it works or not, it's hard to tell later. This is in this case. And the other case, I don't know. Gerhard Basaraki was a very important man in the Christian Lutheran Church in the GDR, and he was also a connecting person for the Mennonites. I don't know exactly if the Mennonites knew that he is really a big Stasi man.
And
concerning the Soviet situation, the Mennonites in the USSR, the people in the local congregations had almost no direct contacts to MCC people. We had a couple of representatives in the Baptist Union that had contacts to MCC. We have to keep in mind that before 1966, no official contacts were possible. And after 1969, the contacts were sporadic. Regarding the question, did the MCC knew who is who? I think that they could imagine that, but never had at those times information on these contacts and so on. Everything got to the surface after maybe 1991 or so, but one more point, the Soviet state security archives are still closed. So we cannot speak about secured knowledge about these topics.
Thank you. And the next question is from Bernhard as well. What would you suggest for current day Mennonite MCC working in situations such as Laos, DPRK, Syria, or Cambodia in the 1980s? How might we avoid working with government officials? And this is from Ruth Clements.
Yeah, this is the question I also think about all the time. What is the alternative? What can we do? I think we should be aware, and we should know when we go in this kind of countries, we should know that there is all the time a kind of a security service behind. And don't think that we are bigger than them. This is the question, who is the horse and who is the rider? And if we go there and think we can manage all the situation, then we should be very, very careful whom we bring also in danger when we go there. Like the students, we make an atmosphere that everybody is free to talk about, and we always have to know that there are some ears listening also, and what will they do out of that? And this is a very tricky situation. I don't have any fast answer on that, but we have to be like what do you call like the snails. We have to not only go in like the doves and say it's okay, we bring peace, but we also have to be careful with whom we talk and what is going on, and also with the friends and brothers and sisters we have together, that we always have to think about who is also listening in this situation. But it's right, when we go in these kind of countries, and this is what I learned from MCC, they always go official in this country. They don't want to do some illegal things because this is a lot more dangerous for the people. And so you go official there, and that means you get somebody next to you, which is guaranteed from the state security, because it's an official contact between East and West in a Cold War. Okay, my decision is maybe just be a lot more careful and don't go naive and think we come in the name of Christ and everything is good.
Thank you. And this question is now for Ben, and it's from Harold and Naomi, I guess. And you speak of Mennonites as though they are a monolithic community. Do you have information about voices among Mennonites in Russia during the German occupation who spoke up against what they were doing against the Jews?
There are great resources on Mennonites who opposed anti-Semitism, which was certainly possible even under Nazi rule, and those are written by Stefan Ussr in the context of France and Alla Hokema in the context of the Netherlands. I recommend the works of those historians to you. In general, there is much more evidence of resistance to Nazism and anti-Semitism in those communities in Western Europe. There is not substantial evidence of large-scale successful resistance to Nazi anti-Semitism in Germany, Poland, or the Nazi-occupied Soviet Union.
Okay, and the next question is from Belle, and she has two questions, but I will ask perhaps one as well, and it's to I think it must be to everybody. All the three panelists, while I upload the MCC report and your excellent research over the years, I wonder if it will reach the broader Mennonite community. The distorted version of history is widely accepted as history. And I think the question is, do you think your research will reach the wider community of the Mennonites?
I think that question is for me, but I'm happy to answer it briefly and then turn it over to my fellow panelists if they want to talk about the ways in which their work has a significance for the broader Mennonite community and what the sort of popularization strategy would be for making your excellent presentations and research widely available. Thanks, Belle. I think that these questions that you posed are ones that are close to my heart. I think that this is a very challenging set of questions, something that I've been wrestling with for a long time, and I don't necessarily have great answers for you. I think that these are questions for leaders in Mennonite church institutions and of course for Mennonite Central Committee. One of the implications of the research that I've been doing is to look at the ways in which narratives that Mennonite Central Committee created after World War II for the general public and for Mennonite churches specifically as well helped to downplay the history of Mennonite anti-Semitism and Mennonite Nazi collaboration. And in my opinion, that's in some ways one of the longest lasting legacies of this history, is this narrative of Mennonite innocence in the context of the Second World War. And that has, that particular narrative is largely, or at least very significantly due to the public relations work that Mennonite Central Committee did among Mennonite churches at the time in the late 1940s and early 1950s through speaking tours, leafleting, and the Mennonite press, and continued long afterwards through a series of very famous talks given, for example, by Peter Dyck in a book that Peter and Elfrida Dyck wrote called Up from the Rubble. These are very beloved figures in the Mennonite community and very closely associated with the name Mennonite Central Committee. And because MCC was so significant in the production of this narrative of almost blanket Mennonite innocence during the Second World War, I do think that it's appropriate for MCC to be at the forefront of thinking about how ought the organization be involved in changing that narrative among Mennonites generally, including people who might not be at panels like this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think for Johannes and Bernhard, our time is up. And it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much to our panelists for this spirited discussion and the participants who raised questions. I know there are some questions that are remaining, but I'm sure they will be, I mean, the panelists saw them and they will take cognizance of them. We thank the participants, we thank everybody. And again, we thank the place that hosts this presentation, which is the Treaty 1 territory. I would want to close up by saying, quoting these words from Maya Angelou about history and the presentations. Quote, history, despite its ranging pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not to be lived again. Thank you. And our next presentation is going to be at 10:30 and is going to be entitled Programmatic Shifts Within MCC Over a Century. Thank you very much.